They tore down my water tower while I was halfway across the world, and by the time I got back, the only thing left standing was the kind of anger you don't shake off easy. I didn't yell, didn't call the cops first, didn't even step out of my truck for a good minute. I just sat there, staring at the empty patch of dirt where something that had stood for almost 50 years was suddenly gone, like it had never existed at all. And right then, I knew this wasn't going to end with a handshake or some polite neighborly conversation. This was going to get ugly, one way or another. I own just under 20 acres up on a ridge outside a small town most people have never heard of, the kind of place where the wind carries sound for miles and everybody thinks they know everybody, even when they don't. I moved there back in 2006, took over the land from my grandfather after he passed, and if you'd ever met him, you'd understand why that place meant more than just property lines and tax records. He built things with his hands, real things, not decorative nonsense, not something you post pictures of online. Things that worked, things that lasted, things that made life possible out there. The water tower was one of those things. It wasn't pretty in the way city folks like to define pretty. No glass, no polished steel, no designer curves, just solid stone, hand-laid, rising up against the sky like it belonged there more than anything else. It fed the entire property through a gravity system, no pumps running all day, no dependence on the grid, just pressure from elevation and a design that had outlived 3 generations. It supplied the house, the irrigation lines, the livestock troughs, everything. You don't realize how much water matters until you've had to manage it yourself. For years, nobody questioned it. Nobody even really paid attention. Then the land next to mine sold. And that's when things started shifting. The new owners were a couple from out of state, California originally, though they'd been bouncing around a few cities before landing here. Their names were Adrian and Elise Mercer. You could tell right away they weren't used to rural life. Not really. Everything they wore looked too clean, too intentional, like they were playing a role instead of living it. Nice enough on the surface, though. The first time I met Adrian, I was out by the tower checking a pressure valve that had been acting up. He walked up with that easy smile some people practice in mirrors, stuck out his hand, and said, "Hey there, neighbor. That your structure?" I told him, yeah, been in the family for decades, still runs the whole property. He nodded like he understood, though I could tell he didn't, not really. "Interesting," he said, glancing up at it. "It's kind of a statement piece." I remember almost laughing at that. A statement piece. "It's a water tower," I said. "Keeps everything running." He chuckled a little, like I'd made a joke, then asked a few more questions, nothing aggressive, nothing that raised any alarms. Just curious, polite, the kind of conversation you forget about 5 minutes later. At least I did. Looking back now, I probably shouldn't have. Over the next couple months, I'd see them here and there. Contractors came in, survey crews, landscapers. They were putting serious money into that place. Big plans. You could tell they weren't just settling in. They were trying to reshape the land into something else, something cleaner, more curated. And every now and then, I'd catch Adrian looking toward my side of the ridge, toward the tower. Not angry, not even annoyed, just calculating. Still, nothing was said. No complaints, no disputes, no letters, no calls. Then I had to leave the country for a few weeks. A friend of mine runs an excavation business overseas, and he needed help on a project, so I figured why not. I locked everything up, had a neighbor check in on the animals, made sure the system was stable, and I left. And for a while, everything was normal. Or at least, I thought it was. When I got back, it was early morning, still that quiet hour where the sun's just starting to stretch across the hills. I drove up the dirt road, same as always, tires crunching over gravel, already thinking about the work I needed to catch up on. And then I looked up, and something felt wrong. You ever have that moment where your brain notices something before you can even put it into words, like a missing note in a song you've heard 1,000 times? That's what it felt like. I stopped the truck halfway up the drive, leaned forward over the wheel, squinting toward the ridge. And that's when it hit me. The tower was gone. Not damaged. Not partially collapsed. Gone. I got out of the truck slow, like moving too fast might somehow make it worse, and walked the rest of the way up. The closer I got, the more details came into focus, broken stones scattered across the ground, chunks of the base pushed aside like debris from a demolition site, the metal piping ripped clean out, copper stripped like someone knew exactly what they were taking. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't weather. It was deliberate. And standing there, In the middle of what used to be the backbone of my entire property, I felt something shift inside me, something quiet but solid, like a line being drawn. I pulled out my phone and called Adrian. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said, casual as ever. "You back already?" I didn't waste time. "Where's my tower?" There was a pause, not long, but long enough. "Oh, that thing," he said. "Yeah, we had it removed." Removed. Like it was a piece of yard furniture. "That thing supplied water to my entire property," I said, keeping my voice level. "It was fully functional, and it's on my land." "Well," he replied, tone shifting just a bit. "Our consultant said it was obstructing the view line from our main terrace. It didn't really fit the aesthetic we're going for." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. "You tore down my infrastructure because of your view?" He exhaled, like I was being difficult. "Look, man, people out here drill wells all the time. It's not a big deal. We figured you'd just upgrade." Upgrade. That word stuck in my head longer than anything else. I looked out over the rubble again, the dust still settling in places, the absence louder than anything that had ever stood there, and I realized something very clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. And if that's how they wanted to play it, then I was about to make a few decisions of my own. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew anything I said in that moment wasn't going to help me, and more importantly, it wasn't going to hurt him the way this situation deserved. There's a kind of anger that burns hot and loud, and then there's the kind that settles in your chest, quiet and patient, the kind that waits for the right moment to do something about it. That's where I was standing, right there on that ridge, phone still in my hand, staring at what used to be the backbone of my entire operation. "Let me make this simple," I finally said. "That tower was surveyed, documented, and fully inside my property line. You had no right to touch it." Adrian let out a short laugh, not nervous, not unsure, confident. "You might want to double-check that," he said. "We had someone look into it before we did anything." That was the moment I realized this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't some rich guy making a bad call on a whim. He thought he was covered. "I'll be in touch," I said, and hung up before he could add anything else. I stood there a little longer, then turned around, got back in my truck, and drove straight into town. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who runs to lawyers every time something goes sideways, but I also know when something crosses from a disagreement into a line you don't uncross. And this was way past that line. There's a guy in town named Richard Hale. Older man, former surveyor turned attorney, the kind of person who doesn't waste words and doesn't bluff unless he already knows the outcome. My grandfather trusted him, and that was enough for me. His office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same wooden desk, same stacks of files, same coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the early 90s. He looked up when I walked in, studied my face for about 2 seconds, and said, "Something's wrong." "They tore down the tower," I said. He didn't react right away, just leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and nodded once slow. "Tell me everything." So I did. The call, the explanation, the consultant, the view line, all of it. When I finished, he opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the desk. "Survey from 2006, he said. "Certified. Recorded with the county." I flipped it open, and there it was, clear as day. Boundary lines, elevation marks, and the tower, sitting well within my property. "No overlap," he added. "Not even close." I felt something tighten in my chest again. But this time, it wasn't just anger. It was direction. "What are my options?" I asked. Richard leaned forward slightly, tapping the edge of the document. "He destroyed functional infrastructure," he said. "Not decorative, not optional, essential. That's a different category of liability." "How different?" He looked me straight in the eye. "Replacement value, system loss, disruption of use. You're easily looking at a few $100,000. Maybe more, depending on how we document it." I nodded slowly. "And if he doesn't pay?" Richard paused for just a second, then said something that shifted the entire trajectory of what was about to happen. "Then we pursue equivalent remedy." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said calmly. "The court can authorize you to remove assets of equal assessed value from his property to satisfy the loss." For a second, the room felt very quiet. "You're serious?" "I don't joke about property law," he replied. I sat back, letting that settle in, the idea that this didn't have to end with me chasing compensation through paperwork and delays, that there was a version of this where the consequence was immediate, visible, undeniable. All right, I said. Let's do it right. And that's exactly what we did. Over the next few days, everything got documented. Every pipe, every connection, every part of the system that had relied on that tower. We brought in an engineer to assess the full scope of the damage, not just what was visible, but what had been disrupted downstream. Irrigation pressure, livestock supply, household dependency, all of it. The number came back at $312,000. Richard rounded it down to $310 for the formal demand. Clean, simple, direct. He drafted the letter that same afternoon. 7 days to pay in full, or we escalate. No threats, no emotion, just facts and consequences. We sent it certified, and then we waited. Day 1 passed. Nothing. Day 3, still nothing. By day 5, I wasn't expecting a reasonable response, but what came in on day 6 still managed to surprise me. It wasn't from Adrian. It was from a law firm out of the city. 3 pages of carefully worded nonsense, arguing that the tower was aesthetic in nature, that it negatively impacted the visual continuity of adjacent properties, and that their client was willing, in good faith, to offer $12,000 to cover the cost of drilling a modern well. $12,000 for something that had taken decades to build, maintain, and integrate into the land. I read it twice, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Then I handed it to Richard. He skimmed the first page, exhaled through his nose, and set it down. "They're testing you," he said. "Testing what? How far you're willing to go?" I nodded once. "Then let's make that clear." We filed the case the next morning. Infrastructure destruction, property violation, full damages, and alongside it, a request for equivalent enforcement. That's when things started moving faster. Lawyers went back and forth, filings stacked up, statements were taken, and through all of it, Adrian didn't slow down for a second. In fact, he doubled down. About 3 weeks into the process, I drove up the ridge one afternoon and saw something that made me actually laugh out loud. Not because it was funny, but because of how unbelievable it was. Right where my tower had stood, they were building. Foundation already poured. Steel framing going up. I parked the truck, walked over, and flagged down one of the contractors. "What's this supposed to be?" I asked. "Observation room," he said. "Glass structure. Wraparound view." Of course it was. I didn't even need to guess who that was for. Adrian came out a few minutes later, sunglasses on, like he was stepping into a magazine shoot. He saw me, smiled, that same practice smile. "Hey," he said. "What do you think?" I looked past him at the structure, then back at him. "You're building on my property." He tilted his head slightly. "My attorney says otherwise." I took a step closer. "Your attorney is wrong." He shrugged. "Then I guess the court will sort it out." That was the moment I understood something important. He wasn't just defending a mistake. He was committed to it. And people like that, they don't back down until something forces them to. So I stopped trying to talk to him. From that point on, everything went through Richard. We pushed harder, tightened the case, brought in additional documentation, and all the while, that glass structure kept rising, piece by piece, like he was daring the situation to resolve in his favor. 9 weeks after we filed, we got our date. Small courtroom. No drama. No theatrics. Just facts. The judge, an older man named Carter, listened more than he spoke. Asked a few precise questions, reviewed the surveys, the reports, the photos of the tower before and after, and then he leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes moving between both sides of the room. You could feel the shift before he even said anything. "This is not a matter of aesthetic preference," he said finally. "This is functional infrastructure located entirely within the plaintiff's property boundary." Adrian's attorney started to interject, but the judge raised a hand slightly, and that was the end of that. "The destruction of said structure constitutes clear liability." He paused, glanced down at the documents one more time, then delivered the part that mattered. "Plaintiff is authorized to pursue equivalent remedy, including removal of defendant's property matching assessed damages." There it was. Clear, direct, final. No delays. No negotiation. "Execution authorized immediately," he added. And just like that, the waiting part was over. I walked out of that courtroom, pulled out my phone, and made a call I'd already been planning for weeks. "Yeah," I said when he picked up. "You still available today?" There was a brief pause on the other end, then a chuckle. "For that job," he said. "I've been waiting." I looked back toward the courthouse doors. where Adrian was still inside, probably being told what had just happened in terms he wasn't going to like. And I said, "Good, because we're starting now." By the time Adrian walked out of that courthouse, I was already halfway back to the property. And the thing about decisions like that, once you make them, really make them, there's no hesitation left, no second guessing, just a straight line from cause to effect. I didn't feel rushed, didn't feel reckless. If anything, I felt clearer than I had in weeks, like everything that had been building finally had somewhere to go. When I pulled up to the ridge, the crew was already there. I'd called in a guy named Marcus Keene, ran a demolition outfit about an hour out. Someone I'd worked with years back on a barn teardown after a storm took it halfway down. Solid guy, no nonsense, the kind who doesn't ask questions once the paperwork checks out. 2 excavators, a skid steer, and a flatbed with tools lined up like they were preparing for surgery, just a different kind. Marcus walked over as I stepped out of the truck, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave me a look that said he already knew this wasn't a normal job. "You got the order?" he asked. I handed it to him. He read it once, nodded, then handed it back. "All right," he said. "What are we taking down?" I turned and pointed across the property line. Adrian's place sat just a little higher on the ridge, designed to look like it floated over the valley, all glass and clean lines and carefully placed stone, and right off the back of it, stretching out toward the view he cared so much about, was the thing that caught my eye the first time I saw it weeks ago. An infinity pool. Not just any pool either. This was the kind of setup you see in luxury magazines. The edge disappearing into the horizon, water blending into sky, built to impress people who don't ask where the water comes from or what it takes to keep it there. "That," I said. Marcus followed my line of sight, squinted a little, then let out a low whistle. Whole thing. Whole thing." He nodded once. "All right, boys," he called out, turning back to his crew. "Let's get to work." And just like that, it started. There's something strange about watching something expensive come apart piece by piece, not in a chaotic way, not reckless or wild, but methodical, deliberate. The first machine rolled forward slow, metal tracks pressing into the gravel, arm lifting, positioning, then coming down with a force that echoed across the ridge. The outer decking cracked first. A sharp, clean break, like snapping bone. Glass panels along the edge shattered next, not all at once, but in waves, each impact sending a spiderweb of fractures racing across the surface before collapsing inward. Water started spilling over unevenly now, no longer controlled, no longer part of a design, just gravity doing what it does. Pipes got exposed, then ripped free. Filtration units dragged out, wiring snapped, heating components crushed under steel weight. The smooth, polished look that had probably taken months to build started unraveling in hours. I didn't say much, just stood there, arms folded, watching, not smiling, not celebrating, just witnessing. Because this wasn't about enjoyment. It was about balance. About something being made right in the only language that seemed to register anymore. A few hours in, you could already see the shape of it changing. The clean lines were gone, replaced by jagged edges, broken concrete, exposed rebar twisting like veins. Water pooled in uneven patches before soaking into the ground or draining off the side. By the end of the first day, half of it was gone. By midday the next, there was nothing left but a torn-up section of earth where something expensive used to sit. That's when Adrian showed up. Black SUV came up the drive faster than it should have. Tires kicking dust into the air, engine cutting hard as the door flew open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. He stepped out like he'd been hit with something he didn't see coming, eyes locked on the scene in front of him. The machines, the debris, the absence. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, voice cracking somewhere between anger and disbelief. Nobody answered right away. The machines kept moving. Marcus gave me a quick glance, like he was checking if I wanted him to pause. I shook my head slightly. Not yet. Adrian stormed closer, boots slipping slightly on loose gravel, pointing at the wreckage like that alone could reverse it. "You don't get to do this," he yelled. "This is destruction of property. This is illegal. This is—" I stepped forward then, just enough to bring his focus onto me. "It's authorized." He froze for half a second. "What?" I pulled the folded document from my jacket and held it out. "Court order," I said. "Equivalent remedy. Assessed value, $310,000. He didn't take it at first. just stared at me like I'd said something that didn't fit into his understanding of how things were supposed to work. No, that's not how this works, he said, shaking his head. You don't just show up and you tore down my water system. I cut in, still calm. This is the equivalent. He snatched the paper then, eyes scanning it fast, like if he read it quick enough it might say something different. Behind him, Elise stepped out of the SUV slower, taking in the scene without saying a word. Her expression wasn't anger, not exactly, more like realization. Adrian, though, he was unraveling. This is insane, he said. I'm calling my lawyer. I'm filing a suit. You're done. I nodded slightly. You can try. And that was the thing he did. Over the next couple weeks, there were more filings, more claims, malicious destruction, emotional distress, loss of enjoyment of property, every angle they could think of. But the foundation of it all never changed. He acted first. He crossed the line. And everything that followed traced back to that. When it went back in front of the judge, it didn't take long. Same courtroom. Same quiet. Adrian's attorney spoke longer this time, tried to reframe it, tried to paint it as excessive, retaliatory beyond reason. But the documentation didn't move, the timeline didn't shift, and the order had been clear from the start. The judge listened, then shook his head once. Defendant initiated unlawful destruction of essential infrastructure, he said. Plaintiff acted within court-authorized remedy. That was it. Claims denied. And then, almost as an afterthought, one more piece. Defendant will cover plaintiff's legal fees. $89,000. Just like that. When we walked out of there the second time, Adrian didn't say a word to me. Didn't look at me either. Just walked past like I wasn't there, like the whole thing hadn't happened, or maybe like acknowledging it would make it worse. I stood there for a second, watching him go, and I'll be honest, I expected to feel something bigger in that moment. Satisfaction, maybe. Closure. But what I felt instead was quieter than that. Not empty. Just settled. Like something had run its course. A few weeks later, I started rebuilding the tower. Not exactly the same, but close enough to honor what it was. Stone again. Elevated. Functional. Something that made sense for the land, not for appearances. And every now and then, when I'm up there checking the system, I'll glance over toward Adrian's side of the ridge. The view's still there. Wide open. Unobstructed. Just the way he wanted it. Only now, there's a section of ground where that pool used to be that hasn't quite recovered yet. Like the land remembers what happened, even if people try not to. And I think about how all of this started. Not with anger. Not with a fight. Just a decision to treat something essential like it didn't matter. And that's the part one keep coming back to. Because out here, things matter. Land matters. Water matters. Boundaries matter. You ignore that, and eventually, something reminds you. So I'll leave it at that. You tell me, was it justice, or did it go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors who forgot where the line was, I'd be curious to hear how that played out too. And yeah, if you want more stories like this, you know what to do.